feel like nowadays everyone they start training because they want to get in the UFC, which I think is really, really dumb. That's like, you know, starting your kid off in t-ball and expecting him to get to, you know, Major League Baseball. So for me, it was, I started doing jiu-jitsu because I wanted to tap out all my friends on the trampoline. Never one of the bigger kids. You know, I was always, you know, I was a little bit small than average. So jiu-jitsu was really, really good for me because I'm never going to be King Kong. You know, it was really good for me because I could beat people that, you know, were much bigger and stronger and faster than me. You know, I love the fact that, you know, you could outsmart someone. You know, it was completely outsmart someone, and that's what jiu-jitsu is. You just got to be smarter. You know, I look at jiu-jitsu as like constantly learning. You know, it's doing a lot of reps and like that, but it's who knows the most. And for me, that's what got me hooked. Like, I'd be taking showers after the gym, and I couldn't stop thinking about, you know, every single transition and scramble, and you know, times that I got caught, and times that I caught other people, and what I could have done to not get caught, or what they could have done to give me problems, so the next time I could be ready for that. It was just like this non-stop, you know, kind of, you know, counter game of like, oh, if they do this, you do this. And for me, that was what got me hooked. I hate losing. You know, like, yeah, I hate losing. You know, always, like, you know, when I was in, so I played baseball when I was little. And one of the things I was in like second grade, and I think I've always kind of like thought a little bit like ahead of like my age. Like, I remember being in like second and third grade, and there was one team in like Little League, and they practiced like a couple times a week, and then my team practiced like maybe one time a week. And the team that practiced a lot, they always won. Every single year, they won, they smashed everyone. They would go like undefeated like 5 or 6 years in a row. And, you know, I'm like, oh, you know, those guys are winning because they're practicing so much. So I always looked at that, like when I was doing jiu-jitsu and stuff like that. Like, I would always be here early, I would leave late, I'd be here every day. You know, and I just, you know, if you're gonna do something, you should do it. You know, you shouldn't just kind of, you know, just jump in a little bit. You know, you should jump in 100%. You should go with it as much as you can. You should put every bit of energy and effort you have into it. So that's why I was with jiu-jitsu. You know, I was here early, and I was always training hard, and I did really, really well. I had good results. So because of that, you know, I just applied that to everything.
You would describe to people how MMA training could be a lot safer than, say, boxing, where they're taking blows.
Yep, and MMA is much more safer than boxing. Whether you're talking training or the fights. In MMA, the downside we have is that kicks, knees, elbows can create more force. Okay, but again, if you're talking about the concussion thing, that's going to be your first concussion, and then, you know, generally the fight's going to get stopped. If you get hit with enough to get a concussion, the fight's going to get stopped, because we don't have a time to recover. It's if you get hit and you lose your coordination, the fight is over. You know, the referee jumps in. You know, you might get hit with 1 or 2 little shots after, sometimes a big shot, but the fight is generally stopped right away. In boxing, first of all, you have gloves that are designed to allow you to keep getting hit. So, and you don't get you won't get cut as much. We get cut a lot because of our gloves. They're smaller. Their gloves are designed to pad. And in a boxing, you go down, they give you a 10 count. So they give you time, so you cannot stand up. And they give you 10 seconds to get back to your feet. And then pretty much always, once you go down, once you get back up, if you got your bell rung good, someone's coming, they're going to put you down again, you know, with an even worse shot. So, you know, and so that's talking about the fight. Now, training is the exact same thing. You know, in boxing, you will never ever see a boxing match where someone comes out of that fight without a concussion. You know, or, you know, sometimes it'll go to decision, but for the most part, when someone finishes a fight, they're knocking the guy out. They're going to hit you so hard in the head that you can't stand anymore. You don't know where you are. You can't get on your feet. You have no coordination. I've had fights where me or the other guy didn't get hit once. You know, I've taken guys down and I've submitted them, you know, quickly, and it doesn't mean that, you know, I destroyed their arm or their elbow or their shoulder or their knee, or, you know, it's like I caught them in a choke, and you know, they tapped out, you know, and both of us took 0 damage, you know, and like we left the ring as absolutely as healthy as we entered, and that'll never be the case in boxing. You know, guys get hit, and it's always, okay, concussion. You know, it's like, you know, professional boxers, you get, you know, 30 losses, probably 35 concussions, 40 concussions. You know, it's pretty crazy the difference between the two. I am definitely an introvert. I'm pretty quiet. You know, if someone comes up and starts talking to me, I can talk all day long. You know, but I won't walk up to someone else and start talking. I don't start up a big conversation. You know, in general, I would rather listen to people and kind of take in what they're putting out than to try and, you know, influence everyone else and try and let them think what I think. You know, because a lot of times, you know, like, people aren't going to think the same as me. You know, I look at things a little bit differently in a lot of cases. So if they're not kind of on the same page with me to begin with, they're definitely not going to agree with me. So I generally would rather let other people do the talking, and I'll just do the listening. I fight because I'm highly competitive. I went to school for 4 years. I got a degree in computer science, and I almost made more money in a weekend for the UFC than I would have made for my whole year working. And I like my job. And I went back to my job on Monday after the fight. But then, I went on the Ultimate Fighter, and I just saw there are a couple other guys. One guy in particular, Alan Berube, who was on the show with me, and he wanted to train so hard. He wanted, but he was just a little bit older, and he was just jumping into the game way too late. If he had jumped in 10 years earlier, 5 years earlier, he would have been a great fighter. But he wasn't, So I just didn't want to be that guy that was going to get kind of passed over. I was kind of on the, I don't say I was on the leading edge, but I was at the top level, and I was doing well. So I wanted to make sure I stayed there. I didn't want to get passed by all these other people because I was trying to train and work at the same time. I'm like, you know what, I'm going to do this 100%. I'm going to, just like I said, I'm going to jump in both feet. And in the beginning, I didn't like the idea of being a full-time fighter. I just felt like it was something I thought about a little bit, and I feel like you put too much pressure on yourself to perform and win. It's like if I had a job and I was fighting for fun, if I win, cool. If I lose, not the end of the world. Now it's like, okay, now it's your livelihood and it's your job, and so I originally didn't want to become a full-time fighter at all. Like I kind of was trying to avoid it a little bit. But then I went the Ultimate Fighter, and then it was like, I don't want to get passed by. If I have an opportunity to do this, and I fought I think 12 times in the UFC now. I'd only fought one time at that point. Like, I probably wouldn't have had this many fights in the UFC. I probably would have been passed by now if I was doing it, part-time, kind of half-assed. So, I'm glad that, I definitely feel like I made the right decision. I can always go back to computers, I can always do that, but I couldn't go back to fighting it. Once you're past, you're past.